Welcome back to Oliver Scholar's CEO Salon series with your host, Dr. Danielle R. Moss. On today's panel, we'll be discussing the COVID-19 vaccine with expert help from NewYork-Presbyterian Brooklyn Methodist Hospital doctors Christina Carty and Edward Ha. COVID-19 teen vaccinations. Let's talk.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Oliver Scholar CEO Salon series. I'm really excited because I feel like the information we're going to all learn today is pertinent, it's timely, and as our city opens back up after a year of quarantine as a result of this pandemic, I know that you as parents particularly have so many questions about the safety of the COVID-19 vaccination for teens and younger students. So without further ado, I want to begin by introducing Dr. Christina Carty.
Hello, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Carty. I would also like to introduce Dr. Edward Ha.
Hello, hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And finally, we have additional expert support from Stephen Beasley, who is the coordinator of community outreach for the hospital. Thank you, Stephen.
Hello.
So just when so many adults were fretting and ruminating over whether or not they should take the virus, we now see the vaccine being made available to students, I think, as young as 12 years old. So we just want to get a handle on what the potential side effects right now are. How much information do we have about the long-term effects of the vaccine on young people? And again, probably it bears repeating, like, is this vaccine really safe? I've heard a lot of people say it seems like it was awfully quick. 1 minute we had coronavirus, the next minute, just out of a hat, we had a vaccine, and there are so many other diseases and illnesses that we're still waiting for vaccines on. So how did this happen so quickly? So I'm going to let the experts get right into it.
All right, all great questions. Definitely have gotten them before, and I'm very happy to address them. I'm Christina Carty. I'm a pediatrician finishing up my residency at Methodist. So I've been there for 3 years. We started to give the vaccine to kids, and then I think the hospital just, because of supply or what have you, made it only available for adults. So we still are recommending to all of our pediatric patients 12 and above to get the vaccine. For the younger kids, we're recommending that their parents and any household family members get vaccinated to protect them. So we'll go through all of that, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. All right. Is the slideshow starting?
We can start it.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know if Dr. Ha wanted.
Oh, yes, Dr. Ha.
Can you say something now?
I'm in the Department of Internal Medicine at Brooklyn Methodist. I'm one of the residents as well. I'm finishing up my training there. I've had firsthand experience with COVID since we all kind of got into this whole situation last year come April. We started vaccinating the healthcare providers in December once it got approved. We've been trying to vaccinate our adult population here in the hospital as well. And so far it's been going pretty well. Our numbers are, really gone down. So that's very encouraging. And so I think it's a testament to, how powerful this vaccination, process has been.
All right. So some vaccine overview to get started. So we all want this pandemic to end, right? And I think, especially for kids, It's been a really hard time not going to school. So the vaccine is really going to get us back to normal. So the reasons to get vaccinated, number one, protect yourself. But in protecting yourself, you'll also end up protecting your family and your community. And once the community is protected, we can look towards ending the pandemic. Go to the next slide. So some of the symptoms of COVID, I'm sure some of you here have had it or known somebody who had it. They can range from mild to severe. It could be anywhere from congestion, cough, runny nose, fever with chills, more severe respiratory symptoms like shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, certainly fatigue, diarrhea, muscle or body aches, headache, or a sore throat. And kind of the one special thing is this all sort of sounds like the flu. The one special thing is a loss of taste and smell. That's kind of been, if someone's experiencing that, we're willing to bet it's COVID. So really the issue with this, we talk about how older people or people who have other health problems are at higher risk of severe disease. But the truth is we can't really predict how any individual is going to be affected. So there are life-threatening complications, severe respiratory problems to the point that a person can no longer breathe on their own, hospitalization, ICU, and requiring the ICU. And, we've had quite a death toll with COVID. So again, symptoms can be from mild to severe. I would like to point out from a pediatrician's perspective, the younger children, infants, toddlers, have really, in our experience, had a much more mild course. Adolescents, teenagers, and young adults have been the ones from our age group that have gotten sicker and been a little bit more concerning with COVID. They also spread it. Sorry, go ahead.
Can I ask you a question about that? I think because the way I understood it at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think a lot of young people understood this too, that if you were 25 and under, you were going to get, like, maybe you'd be asymptomatic if you experienced anything at all. And so, how we understand the effect on younger people changed since we began this journey?
I think we've seen a wide variety of how patients present and how their disease course goes. I'm not sure if this is too technical, but there's definitely a theory that because COVID it attaches to these ACE receptors, and really young kids don't have them. So that's why the babies are kind of faring better. Really small infants. My first COVID patient was 5 weeks old. So of course I was terrified to find out the 5-week baby. This was like in the first week of the pandemic, at least how we were experiencing it at Methodist. To find out that she was positive was absolutely terrifying, but she was fine, honestly. It really just seemed like a little cold. And then teenagers I've seen have more of a flu-like course. And then, of course, maybe this is a talk for another day, but if anyone has questions, I'm happy to briefly touch on the multi-system inflammatory syndrome that's been associated with COVID, and that we've seen in more of the older kids and adolescents, and that can be quite severe. So no, unfortunately, younger than 25, I think that line was set a little bit high. All right, so on that note, important for all age groups to be vaccinated, since, the adolescents can have severe disease and certainly spread it, and young kids, we really don't know what the long-term complications of COVID can be. there are plenty of adults who've experienced a long duration of respiratory problems. Their heart can be affected, nervous system, the kidneys can be affected. There's not too much data at this point on how that's going with children, but certainly in the adult population, it's been seen firsthand. So definitely important to vaccinate 12 and above at this point, which is what's approved. So I think something important to point out on this slide is that in the US, there's been 1.6 million hospitalizations and over 500,000 deaths nationwide.
So that's nearly a third of everyone who got COVID didn't make it.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty scary. So we can go to the next slide. So some of the long-term complications can affect these very important systems in our body, the heart. There can be inflammation of the heart muscle, which can be devastating in the short term. That could certainly cause death, the immediate illness. People are reporting this sort of brain fog where they just don't feel quite right. Their cognition is affected. That can involve sort of psychiatric symptoms, depression, anxiety, changes in mood. Also with the nervous system, the smell and taste. Anecdotally, I've heard, people experiencing that for months. So that maybe it's sort of the least of the problems, but certainly not pleasant. Sleep problems, difficulty concentrating, and problems with their memory. The kidneys are another organ which has been seriously affected. In the short term, there can be injury to the kidneys that could progress to more chronic sort of kidney disease. And maybe Dr. Ha can comment a little bit more on this. Certainly, I did take care of adults for a couple weeks during the pandemic. And at that point, it seemed like everyone was it was very early on, it seemed like everyone was starting to realize that a lot of the problems that were arising was because of the increased risk of blood clots. That people were having small blood clots in the tiny vessels everywhere in the body, and it was causing a lot of problems throughout the body. And then, of course, lung damage, which can be long-term and irreversible. An important thing to mention is that the natural immunity after, or the immunity that you have after a natural infection is quite variable in the duration, and it's certainly not going to, so having one variant is certainly not going to protect you against having other variants. So you could be reinfected with a different variant, or potentially a few months down the line be reinfected with the same variant.
Can I ask, have we seen people who got COVID more than once?
There have been a few cases reported. As far as I know, the second occurrence has been less severe, but I don't think it's safe to say that that's necessarily going to be the case. It's really quite unpredictable. So for me, and we do generally recommend that anyone who's had COVID still get the vaccine. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, so like I said before, it's available to kids 12 and up, but I think we'll go into a little bit about community spread and how we, protect other people. So the vaccines that are currently available in the US, they're between 70 to 95% effective at stopping COVID disease. So basically you can contract the virus, but you won't get sick, and that'll really help you to not spread it to other people. And certainly if you do get it and you have some symptoms, it won't be as severe. It's prevented hospitalization and death from COVID. So I'm not too sure how long the virus would be harbored inside the body, but certainly shows that the transmission rate from someone who's vaccinated is quite low, if at all. So if you're vaccinated, you're protected yourself. Then as this slide shows, our vaccinated guy is around his 4 unvaccinated friends. And since he's not going to spread it to them, they're protected by his vaccine. So this is sort of that concept of kids that are too young, under 12, definitely recommending to parents that they get vaccinated to protect their young kids. Do vaccines work? Great question. So yes, so all of the COVID vaccines that are available in the US have been shown to be highly effective. Again, 70 to 95% effective against towards preventing severe COVID-19 disease. So definitely prevent you from getting really sick. Preventing hospitalization or death. And a very, very, very tiny percent, 0.00038% of people that were vaccinated as of April had a COVID-related admission. So that's really, really small number. That was out of 87 million people. And I will mention about the other strains of COVID that I think are becoming a little bit more of concern as time goes on in the US, certainly in other countries, but definitely now around in the US. So there are some people who will get COVID even if they've been vaccinated. We'll call that a breakthrough case. There hasn't really been any kind of identified reason or pattern for that. But there have been a small percentage of people that have experienced that. And in which case, for the most part, those people did, fairly well. Again, that really, really tiny percentage of people who were hospitalized. So, was there a question? No. Okay. Yeah. So we are recommending, and the CDC is recommending, that anyone eligible gets vaccinated. To go into some data to kind of give evidence about why we believe the vaccine is effective. So these were huge studies that were done. And we'll kind of go into the timeline, which I've certainly gotten questions from parents. And it occurred to me in the beginning, this is happening awfully fast. How could we know that it's good? But when you really look into it, it was a lot more of the paperwork and the red tape that didn't happen, and that's usually what makes this process so long. And because this was an emergency of public health, those steps in the process and those hurdles were dealt with more swiftly to make this come to market a lot faster. So to give you some numbers, because who doesn't love evidence? So the Pfizer studies, there were over 36,000 people, and 95% of them were protected against COVID-19 with symptoms. So out of 36,000 people who were vaccinated in the Pfizer study, 95% were protected, meaning 5% had some symptoms when they contracted COVID. The Moderna study, there were 30,000 people. So these are huge numbers. This showed 94.5% protection against COVID-19 infection. So that's really not, we like to look at the numbers and say like, oh, which vaccine is better, but that's really not too significant. And then the Johnson & Johnson, an even bigger study, this is 44,000 people. This showed a 72% protection against moderate to severe COVID-19 disease in the US. In Latin America was 66%, and in South Africa was 57%. And this is likely because it was different variants that are more infective, more severe, and overall showed an 85% protection against severe disease. So it's important to remember the J&J vaccine is just one shot, and Pfizer and Moderna are 2 shots. So it is a different vaccine. I know 72% doesn't sound as good, but that's still quite good. And considering it's only one shot, that's certainly an advantage that would be important to consider for certain populations where access might be an issue.
You've talked about variants a little bit. Can you tell us what you mean by variants and why or why not do we need to be concerned?
Sure. So viruses mutate quite frequently. And there are many different, so a variant is basically a different form. You might also hear the word strain. It's the same virus, but it's a little bit different, and some are going to be worse than others. So India is currently having a big problem with a particular variant there that's very it's more easily transmitted, and it causes more severe disease across the board. So there are a few different variants throughout the world that have kind of shown themselves to be worse than others.
So I got vaccinated. I finished my second shot at the end of March.
Mm-hmm.
Should I now be concerned about the Indian variant?
So again, it's not a complete protection in the sense that you can't get it, but you're still protected against severe disease. So huge benefit across all the variants. All right, and then back to the studies. So Pfizer is currently, well, they are currently studying in younger groups, but they've made it to phase 3, which is sort of the kind of a pivotal point where we're very close to market. So in phase 3 trial included adolescents ages 12 to 15 years, and there were 2,200 kids enrolled in the study. And what's interesting, if you remember the other numbers, we didn't reach 100% for anything, but for this age group, for the Pfizer vaccine, they reached 100% protection against COVID-19 infection with symptoms.
Can you say that again?
100% protection in ages 12 to 15. And children definitely have shown to have a better response to vaccine, not just COVID vaccine, but vaccines in general. Certainly, for example, the Gardasil shot. We always recommend, even though a kid who's 9 or 10 it's probably not super high risk for contracting HPV, but they just mount this really great immune response that is more protective and stronger than an older kid. So this sort of falls in line with that thinking about the immune system of the pediatric population. And this definitely is very encouraging since teenagers have certainly had a problem with social distancing and that sort of thing. So I think this is really, really incredible news. All right, next slide, please. I think this is my last one. Okay, vaccine safety. So as a pediatrician, this is a question that I get literally every day. A lot of concern about vaccine safety, and I totally get it. Someone's injecting a foreign substance into your precious child. So, there's a lot of concern. And again, with something that came onto the market so quickly, of course, there's going to be suspicion. I think that's totally understandable and really important that we talk about that and kind of tease that out and make sure that parents and kids are comfortable with the COVID vaccine. So again, huge numbers of people were enrolled in these studies, tens of thousands. And we do have quite a bit of safety data. It hasn't been long enough that we can say for sure there's no long-term effect. It's not believed that there would be. Theoretically, that doesn't really make too much sense. But certainly during the enrollment period, and I would like to point out that after a clinical trial, after the active portion where the patient or where the participant rather is receiving the drug or vaccine or whatever is being studied, after they end their period of participation, they're still followed up with for quite some time. So anything that happens after their portion of the study has been completed would still be reported to the company. Company being Pfizer, Moderna, or J&J, and they would have to report that. So since this has been tested and studied in so many people, we are quite confident at this point that it is safe. And so again, just to go back to the numbers, there have been 280 million people vaccinated since the end of May. And at least, so that's about, 280 million vaccine doses have been administered. 160 million people have received at least one dose, and about 127 million have been fully vaccinated. So that's almost 40% of the population, 38.1%, almost 40%. That's pretty good, not quite at the herd immunity range that we're looking for, but I think pretty good in this short period of time. And again, the CDC, the FDA, and all these sort of regulatory entities continually monitor the safety of the vaccine. And even people who've received it who were not in a study, their doctor, if they do have a complication that's believed to be related to the vaccine, their doctor reports it. So it is being monitored throughout the population of those who have been vaccinated. I would like to mention, since J&J is back on the market, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, there were a few cases of severe blood clots with that particular vaccine. And that's the reason that it was taken off the market, to investigate what happened. And then it was determined that it was very unlikely to be related. It was only about 1 out of every 500,000 doses. So it was taken off the market in order to facilitate investigation, make sure it was safe. It was determined to be safe, and that's why it's back on. So, no reason to be too alarmed about that. And I think the process of safety monitoring and the regulatory process can be confusing. It's sketchy and scary if something's taken off the market, but it honestly should be reassuring, because it means that The pharmaceutical companies and the regulatory agencies are doing their job and being really vigilant to make sure that the vaccine is safe for us and continues to be safe. So at this point, I think, we can be really confident that it is safe.
Thank you. You mentioned something about herd immunity.
Yeah.
This is a term that's all over the internet and CNN and MSNBC. What exactly is it, and why does getting vaccinated help to facilitate herd immunity?
Sure. So herd immunity occurs when about 80+% of the population is immune to a particular disease. So I think a great example is measles. We have had some outbreaks in recent years. If a population has been largely exposed to a disease and then has immunity, that could potentially fall into the category of herd immunity. Although again, the natural immunity can be somewhat unpredictable. But with vaccines, if you have at least 80% of people who are vaccinated, the incidence of the disease is going to be so low that those individuals who are not vaccinated are still going to be very unlikely to get it. So basically, without this huge number of people who's getting sick and carrying disease and spreading it around their community, anyone who can't get the vaccine is still protected. And measles is a good example because that particular vaccine is not available to patients who have certain medical problems. Anyone whose immune system is weakened can't receive that vaccine at that period of time. So it is really important that the community around them is protected. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. And it makes sense. So would you say that when we don't get access to vaccines on a very quick turnaround, it's like, how did science respond so quickly to this pandemic? I think that's also the question. It's like not just the regulatory concerns.
Yeah.
It's like, are they just making this up to calm everyone down? Like, how did science?
No. Well, I'll be going into that on the next couple of slides.
Yeah. Dr. Haas going to go into the types of vaccines and yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah, so the exact question that you asked, they're all very good questions. So, how did they make the vaccine so quickly, right? I mean, it's very hard not to be skeptical when we've only heard about this for a year, and already, we're hearing about this vaccine that's been developed in record time, right? This has been a huge undertaking. It's never been done before at this scale and size. And I think that's, a large part, a big credit to the U.S. government for actually facilitating this process. If you can just go back to the previous slide. So how did they? There's a very nice article on National Geographic Online published by Julianne Kramer that kind of goes into this backstory about how everything got set up so perfectly. But essentially, the technology that has gotten into this vaccine has been developed with, just like other things that are, that come onto the market and develop. There's decades and decades of research behind it, right? Nothing's made overnight.
And a question?
Yeah.
If we only had this virus for the last year and a half,
right?
How is there decades of research to rely on? Right.
So the technology for making this particular vaccine has been developed, for the past 20 years or so. And it's been a lot of, little victories that have kind of led to this big victory. But essentially how the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine work is it enables your body to identify just one piece of the coronavirus. And that's called the spike protein. And it's a little protein on the surface of the cell that the cell needs to get into, the cells in our human body. And it essentially targets that protein. So theoretically, you can make a vaccine to target any protein out there. And what they've done is they've just, replaced that protein in the vaccine so that our body recognizes that protein as foreign, and it'll make antibodies against it, and it'll allow us to generate, an immune response so that it can isolate it and, kill it before it spreads within the body. So, isolating that protein, that was kind of what they did over the past year. But, there was a lot of technology that goes behind on stabilizing that protein and how, our body was able to recognize it. And that's kind of what the technology that's been developed over the past 10, 20 years on other viruses. So, researchers have been using the same kind of technology on, they've been trying to develop these vaccines for other viruses before COVID-19, like the RSV virus, the SARS-1 virus, the MERS virus. There was never really a big need in the market for those vaccines to come into development so quickly. So it never really made it into market. But the technology that's kind of been developed over the past 20 years or so. When the pandemic surfaced in China, they, I think it was around January or December or so, the researchers, they were working with a National Institute of Health and a couple of the universities in the country, and they decided to basically find the virus in China and bring it over here, in the lab, basically, to study it. So they were able to analyze the genetic code of the virus to isolate that protein, right? And all that technology of how to isolate that protein and, take pictures of the protein and, how to stabilize that protein so that we can make the response. That's the technology that's been, over 20 years. And if there was another virus that came along, I think, they would try to probably use the same approach, right? So it's kind of, so that's essentially, what's been going on. As far as, the regulatory process, that I think has definitely been streamlined because during this pandemic, the FDA and the CDC and the US government really, they had to focus on just, getting these vaccines developed. So, all the other projects that everyone else was working on took a backseat, right? So, they weren't focused on that. All that red tape was, gone. So, all the attention was on these manufacturing companies and the labs to see if, this would be an effective vaccine. And, that was kind of like how everything was streamlined. I think that was, it's definitely remarkable, I think, as far as, the turnaround time and how far, how quickly we were able to generate that. And yeah, and if we can go to the next slide, we can go over some of the kind of what goes in. We mentioned the research that goes into, the product, and that's been over 20 years or so. I believe that the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine actually uses the same technology as far as stabilizing that protein. So, that takes many, many years, and I think we were just very, very fortunate to have that technology where it was, so that they were able to just pick it up and run with it and use it and apply it to the COVID virus. Traditionally, when there's a new biomedical technology coming into play, it has to go through these rigorous testing phases called clinical trials. And these are usually, they're compartmentalized into 3 different phases: phase 1, 2, and 3. And each of these phases can take anywhere from, a year to a couple years to maybe even 3 years. The first phase is usually concerned with finding the right dose of the drug or medication that, is being developed. And how much of a dose would be toxic to the human body. It's not concerned with whether it works or not. That's where phase 2 comes in. Once the right dose is figured out, it moves on to phase 2 trials where the efficacy is tested to see whether the body is able to, for example, generate an immune response to the virus. And the next step would be phase 3, and that's usually the study that's going to be comparing it to whatever is out there in the general public. So it's basically tested to the standard of care. And here, there was really nothing for COVID-19. There was no vaccine to be tested against. So, I think that really helped kind of combine the phases into 2 and 3. So, these phases actually, they allowed the manufacturing companies to combine these phases into a phase 1, 2, 3 trial and kind of run them in parallel without having to do one, go back to the FDA, get permission to do phase 2 and then go back to the FDA, and go back and do phase 3 and then, share the data with the FDA. Whereas here it was kind of like, it was just done, it was very streamlined. And I think, that was kind of what the US government and Operation Warp Speed facilitated. It allowed the FDA to, probably work more closely with the companies and kind of, trim all of this down to just 1 year. So, they started the trials in January of 2020, and they enrolled patients until July. They figured out the doses, they gave the shots, they measured, the immune responses in the lab, and then they compared, 2 groups, the group that got the vaccine versus the group that didn't get the vaccine. And then they followed them for several months to see how many patients in each group ended up getting COVID-19, getting hospitalized, and actually succumbing to the disease. And that's where those percentages come from. And, in December of, 2020, late last year, it received emergency use authorization for the general public. And that's when, we started rolling out the vaccines. So that's essentially kind of what had happened. If we can just go to the next slide, that kind of summarizes what kind of happened, last year, and what happened in a matter of 12 months. I think it also is very, the companies that actually stepped up that were interested in developing these vaccines also have manufacturing capabilities that are already in place. They were able to just it's not that they already knew how to make it, but they had the supplies that they needed. They had the equipment that they needed. It's just a matter of, which, how to make it. And, it's kind of like you have the kitchen already, right? It's just the ingredients are different and the final product is different, right? But, these companies already had these manufacturing plants and they had the kitchen already with the equipment. It's just the ingredients were changed. And, I think that's basically, one of the reasons I think, it was able to come into fruition so quickly. Yeah, and usually the FDA process usually takes, the review takes a long time, but I think, like I said, the focus was all on just getting these vaccines developed, and essentially you had the entire department focusing on this. So I think they were able to, do this in a very concise but yet safe manner, where they were able to not compromise safety, but also get this kind of out there quickly so that we can stop the virus at its tracks, basically. Yeah. So if you can move on to the next slide, which kind of goes into your earlier question about variants. So, what about the new variants, right? We have this vaccine to the coronavirus now. And, I'll just kind of reiterate what Dr. Caridi kind of mentioned. These viruses, they replicate very quickly. And each time it makes a copy of itself, it's kind of like having children, right? Things change, right? So they get little mutations in the virus every time it replicates. And, oftentimes these mutations really don't do anything to the virus. Sometimes it may even actually make it slower. But sometimes, these mutations, the virus gets mutations in certain proteins, like the spike protein that we talked about, that helps it gain entry into the cell. and it actually gives it a survival advantage. Basically, it allows it to bind with higher affinity to the cell, or it allows it to replicate quicker, to be more agile, if you will. And that's kind of what happens and what we're labeling as variants. When these new strains that come about that give it a survival advantage, these are the variants of interest that we're concerned about. Sometimes these viruses get 2 mutations or 3. Oftentimes it's not just one. It could also even be. I think the one in India right now has a combination of variants that were found in Europe and I think in South America somewhere. And it just so happens that one of the viruses ended up with both of those mutations, and it's actually making it that much more difficult to deal with. So obviously, these are very, very concerning. I think as far as the efficacy goes, the manufacturing companies definitely, Pfizer and Moderna, they're already, once the variants are identified, they're not wasting any time. They're taking these viruses to the lab. They're studying these viruses to see how fastly they're, what advantages these mutations really confer onto the variants. And they're also able to test if the current vaccine is able to work, how well it works against these variants. And I believe they've actually started testing booster shots in certain populations, in some of the patients that they're, that were involved in the clinical trial. I'm not entirely sure if they were new participants, but they are testing booster vaccines against these new variants in some of these patients as well. As far as how long, the vaccination, how long it lasts, we don't really know for sure, right? Because we've only had this vaccine around for a year or so. But definitely they're seeing that it lasts at least for a year. There are some new studies coming out that if you've had COVID before and then you get vaccinated, you're very well likely to have immunity against, the current variants and the current strains for well over a year. And I think as if it, and that's I think the point of the booster vaccines is to see if new variants emerge, then we have to start thinking about getting booster shots to tweak that protein to see if we can teach the body to recognize that new protein, right? Because it's going to be looking for the old one, not the new one. Yeah. So if we, moving on to the next slide, I think the next one's about, so yeah, the question is, will this vaccine, hurt my community? And, the simple answer is absolutely not. It's quite, it's quite the opposite, right? We kind of talked about, one aspect of this in terms of herd immunity, and how, vaccinating as many people as we can is going to prevent, I think, the virus from spreading. And if we can prevent the virus from spreading, we can stop the virus from coming up with new variants, right? So that's kind of the whole idea about herd immunity. I think definitely with the number of vaccinations we have at 50% at our current level of, lockdown, if you will, we are kind of seeing this downturn. But you got to keep in mind that a lot of these young folks are still, they're not going to school, right? A lot of them we're still having these social distancing measures in place. So, it's hard to say that, oh, we have 50%, are we there at herd immunity? Probably not. And, I think if we are, if we are fully to return, kind of back to with no restrictions, I think those numbers may very well go up at our current levels. So, it's very important, I think, still to kind of keep the course. And, I think we're definitely heading in the right direction for sure. But yeah, I think, it's, yeah. And yeah. So, the short answer is, it's not going to hurt the community, right? It's more than likely it's going to protect your family members, your loved ones, your friends, and your parents and your grandparents. Because if you don't get vaccinated, you can actually be the one that can maybe reintroduce them with a variant, right? And even if they're vaccinated, that can actually, take us one step back.
So, as a vaccinated person, I've been a little confused because initially I got vaccinated. I was still encouraged to wear a mask in public spaces, socially, to remain socially distant.
Yeah.
And I know I had friends and family members who said, well, if you're vaccinated, why are you still wearing a mask? Why
Right.
should I bother if you're still going to have the same restrictions? And now I have to say that as businesses and cities start to open up again, I'm feeling like, I want to keep my mask on. I didn't have any colds this year. I didn't have the flu or issues with, other bronchial issues that I've had before. So I don't know that the mask is not going to be an ongoing part of my, public space strategy. But it did seem to confuse a lot of people about the efficacy of the vaccine. It's like, are we protected or not?
Right. I think some part of it was probably just out of an abundance of caution. But again, we also have to realize that even with the vaccine, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be able to get the virus. The vaccine the ultimate goal of the vaccine, or the ultimate kind of efficacy, is that it's not going to prevent you from developing these bad symptoms that are going to end you up in the hospital. I don't think it's been studied quite rigorously yet to say confidently that, just because you've been vaccinated doesn't mean that you can't contract the virus. You might even be able to pick up some of that virus, right? It doesn't mean that you're not able to pick it up. It's just that as soon as you pick it up, your body's going to fight it off, right? And kind of contain it, if you will. And that's kind of the issue with the coronavirus. Once it gets in, it replicates so quickly your body can't keep up. But if you have these antibodies, then as soon as it comes in, it'll recognize it and it'll neutralize it. But there's still a chance that it can replicate a little bit, and you might even possibly be able to spread it to somebody else. The chances of that go dramatically down once you get vaccinated, but it doesn't mean that it's completely out of the question. So I think, you bring up a very good point. With the social distancing measures this year, we haven't seen, I personally have not seen a single case of the flu this year. It's completely non-existent in the hospital. The only respiratory virus we've really seen is coronavirus. And I think part of that reason is because the flu virus is not as contagious as the COVID vaccine, and we've been having masks on the whole time. So, we essentially just stopped it at its tracks. Are masks here to stay? I think that's, an important question that we all need to make as a society, as a community. I think that's in some form, I think it will be helpful. But I mean, it's, I don't know, maybe we never really will go back to completely normal. Maybe we will come out with some lessons learned in this, through this experience that we may kind of, keep with us in certain situations or at some point.
Yeah. I remember seeing some of the images where they show you like how far a droplet can travel. And, it would be like if you're in church and everyone's singing and praying in unison, or if you're at a concert. And, I thought about all the shows I've been to at like Madison Square Garden, and just like, oh my God, if I had this infrared image in my head of like people spitting all over me.
It's kind of disgusting. We don't really think about it.
Yeah. But, then I wonder if, it's kind of like the whole situation with peanut butter. The more people who had allergies to peanut butter and we avoided peanut butter, the more people who actually did have an allergy because they hadn't been exposed to peanut butter. As an example, when I was a kid, that was a staple school lunch item. And so, now you just can't have it because so many, it seems like at least more people have allergies to peanut butter. I don't know if we have any questions from the audience. This was like a lot of information, but you all were so incredibly thorough. I definitely want to encourage people to trust the science. We are encouraging those of us who are part of the Oliver Scholars community to definitely get vaccinated. We are doing our summer program virtually again this year. just because it's been so hard for us as an educational and youth organization to plan around the uncertainty that this pandemic has brought on. But I'm certainly looking forward to seeing our young people in person sooner rather than later. And I want us to just all be able to do that safely. And I know that members of the Black and Brown community have a million reasons why, we shouldn't always blindly follow medicine. But I think this is one area where we have an opportunity to keep ourselves and our community safe. I've started following a number of doctors on TikTok, interestingly enough. I don't know if either of you are on TikTok, but this one physician made a good point. He was like, wearing a seatbelt doesn't mean that there's no chance of you, having a serious injury as a result of a car accident, but it certainly improves your chances of surviving. And so we wear a seatbelt, even though there's no such thing as like 100% safety. And, I hope that people will think about this virus in much the same way. Like some of the people who may be following us right now, I've seen, extended family members and other friends, really be devastated by this illness. I have asthma, and so I, recognized my own level of risk, and I felt like, what, I want 95% odds in my favor. I'll take that, right? And so hopefully we can get more of our folks to lean in. And I just want to thank Drs. Caridi and Ha for joining this conversation, for sharing this information. We are going to post this video on our YouTube channel and make sure that the families that weren't able to join us today still have access. Stefan, thank you so much for being our technical support. What you do in terms of getting information into the hands of the community. You and Lauren is just as important because, sometimes we need different channels to access information. And obviously we want to thank New York-Presbyterian Hospital, Brooklyn Methodist, and your president, Rob Gimento, who is a former board member and longtime trustee of Oliver Scholars. So thank you so much and have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.